Noches todes, and welcome to our event tonight. I'm Cristel Jusino Diaz, Centro's Director of Research Program, and I am so excited to be here in conversation tonight with two incredible scholars, colleagues, Vanessa Pérez-Rosario and Emma Amador. So today we're going to be thinking through shifting social work to social justice, feminism, care work, and Puerto Rican women's community building. Pivotal Puerto Rican feminist figures like Julia de Burgos, Yolanda Sanchez, Antonia Pantoja, and countless others have laid the groundwork for community-centered activism. Our guest's recent publications, I Am My Own Path, selected writings of Julia de Burgos, and The Politics of Care Work, Puerto Rican Women Organizing for Social Justice, help us understand the root of these women's work and how it's grounded in a commitment to addressing the high-stakes class struggles of women, migrants, and people of color. Again, I'm just so excited to dig in more into these books. But before we do that, I'm going to introduce our guest. So, Vanessa Pérez-Rosario is a professor of English at Queens College and professor of Latin American, Iberian, and Latinx cultures at the Graduate Center at CUNY. She has published on Caribbean and Latinx literatures and cultures, translation, transnational feminisms, critical archive studies, and friendship. She is the author of Becoming Julia de Burgos, The Making of a Puerto Rican Icon, published in 2014, and this book is also available in Spanish. She is the editor of the bilingual critical edition, I Am My Own Path, Selected Writings of Julia de Burgos, and editor of Hispanic Caribbean Literature of Migration, Narratives of Displacement. She is managing editor of Small Axe, a Caribbean journal of criticism, and she is the recipient of National Fellowship Awards from the Institute for Citizens and Scholars, the American Association of University Women, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. Then Emma Amador is an assistant professor of history at the University of Connecticut, whose work focuses on Puerto Ricans, Latinas in the United States, and histories of women and gender. Her first book, The Politics of Care Work, Puerto Rican Women Organizing for Social Justice, was published by Duke University Press in May 2025. She is now writing a biography of Afro-Puerto Rican civil rights activist Antonia Pantoja. Her work has been supported by fellowships from Centro, the Presidential Postdoctoral Program at Brown University, and the Ford Foundation. She has published in Labor, Studies in Working Class History, ILWCH, International Labor and Working Class History, and Modern American History. And with that, I want to hear more from both of you. So, Vanessa, can you tell us a little bit about the book that we'll be discussing today?
Yes, absolutely. Kristen, thank you so much for the introduction and for organizing this panel and to everyone who was involved at Central to organize this panel. So thank you for that. And I'm also really excited to have this conversation with both you and Emma. So I can tell you a little bit about my book, I Am My Own Path, Selected Writings of Julia de Burgos. It is a bilingual critical edition that was published in October 2025. So it just came out. And the book includes about 30 poems, 30 or so essays by Julia de Burgos, and over 100 letters, mostly letters to her sister from that she wrote, I'd say, between 1940 and 1942, although there are some letters that stretch into later into the 40s. And the book includes a significant amount of scholarly apparatus. So there are notes at the end. One of the things that I was really interested in doing with this project was um, trying to identify how Julia de Burgos would have wanted her poetry to appear and wanted her work to appear. So trying to identify the author's intent, right? The author's desired presentation of her own work. If we think about it, many of these poems were published first in the 1930s, and a lot of time has passed since then, and the publication over the years has changed. Editors may have changed things intentionally or unintentionally, without notes necessarily explaining the kinds of decisions that were made. So that was one of the things that I did. I spent a lot of time comparing different editions and different publications, and I annotate all of that in the back of the book to explain where some changes perhaps were introduced to Julia de Burgos's poetry, and then I attempt to go back to what I believe is the original, because there are very few manuscripts. We don't have a lot of manuscripts of her
Mhm.
work, so I'm thinking of her initial publications as originals. I sort of take them as the originals. Um, I think this is the first time that her essays are really widely available and easily available. There was a scholar in the 1990s who in Puerto Rico who had gone through this newspaper, Pueblos Hispanos, and collected many of the essays, and they were published by Ateneo Puertorriqueño, but it was kind of like a pamphlet form. It didn't circulate, right? You can get it at Centro, but it was not easy to find them. So this book makes that available. And then I offer a critical introduction, and there's also translations. So the book is trying to do a lot of different things. Um, but it makes her letters available in English for the first time. It makes her essays available in Spanish and English for the first time, widely available in Spanish and English for the first time. It offers new translations because even though the poetry had been translated before, it's been over 30 years that translation was published. So it offers kind of new, fresh translations. And so I hope with this book to fill a number of gaps in what was available of Julia de Burgos's work. And the book was recently reviewed in World Literature Today, and the reviewer said this is like a portable archive. It's like a portable archive of Julia de Burgos's work, and so I liked that description. So I'll hang on to that. But I think that gives you a little bit of a sense of the book and what I was hoping to accomplish with that.
Wonderful. And Emma, can you tell us a little bit about your book?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So first, I just want to say thanks so much for bringing us together. It's wonderful to be able to share this space. Thank you, Christelle. Thank you, Vanessa, and everyone at Centro for making this possible. Um, so my book is called The Politics of Care Work, Puerto Rican Women Organizing for Social Justice. And it came out in May 2025 with Duke University Press. And the book is a kind of a project that came out of my dissertation work at the University of Michigan over many, many years, documenting the history of Puerto Rican women's activism around social welfare and social work. And the project is one that is deeply rooted in my own family history. It began with interviews that I did when I was about 18 or 19 years old with my grandmother, who had been a domestic worker who migrated to New York from Puerto Rico. And the stories that I learned about her experience being a care worker in the Puerto Rican diaspora. And again, she came here in the 1940s. And a lot of the stories that she told me about her life and her experience were not the things that I saw reflected in the US history that I was learning, or in the classrooms that I entered even as an undergraduate student. So I became really curious about Puerto Rican women's history through my own family's experience. And this project is a reflection of that, of thinking about kind of who are the figures, especially thinking about women who have been left out of history or who are at the margins of mainstream historical accounts. And the book tells a story of the emergence of what I call a politics of care work among women in Puerto Rico and the US. So the book is a book that is transnational in the sense that it's both about Puerto Ricans on the archipelago and the diaspora. And it covers maybe too long of a period of time from 1917 into the 1970s. So it really is looking at the way that under US colonialism in Puerto Rico, Puerto Rican women began to mobilize around questions of rights and care. And the story that I tell focuses on how the field of social work and also engagement between social workers and working class women who were applying for benefits became a space of rich political mobilization that has been kind of overlooked in previous narratives. And I see that legacy of political organizing and mobilization as something that really matters today, because we continue to have at the forefront of social struggles around citizenship rights, around access to social provisions and benefits. We have oftentimes women who are working in the fields of social welfare, healthcare, education, community organizing, at the forefront of struggles to respond to crises that are facing both Puerto Rico and also the Puerto Rican diaspora. So I think that legacy, that kind of legacy of women's work in caring occupations, their role in sustaining communities is on display right now more than ever. And I hope that the project, this book, offers a historical approach. I'm a historian, so offers a historical approach to the story of that activism. And I also organized the book in a way where it focuses on larger political questions, but also on the lives of Puerto Rican women who, instigated social change in Puerto Rico. So from the earliest chapters to the last chapter, each one of the chapters has kind of mini biographies within it that show how women affected social change. And that goes from the earliest chapter where I look at Beatriz Lasalle, a Puerto Rican social worker who is referred to as kind of the Jane Addams of Puerto Rico, through the last chapters where I look at how social workers in New York City and in the diaspora who were Puerto Rican women turned away from more traditional forms of social work towards community organizing and developing the field of community organizing. And there I look at figures, some of whom were mentioned already, like the woman on my cover, Yolanda Sanchez, like the very important civil rights activist, Antonia Pantoja. I consider some of the ways that these Puerto Rican women during the period after the 1950s turned away from traditional forms of social work and innovated these very exciting projects that demanded community control over social welfare projects in the US. And so the book kind of traces, like, how do we end up in this moment in the 60s and 70s where women are doing that work? One thing I'll say about that, one contribution I hope that the book makes is that Puerto Rican women were political actors on many different levels. So there's the kind of day-to-day work of working in community, advocating for disenfranchised people, people who were poor, people who were seeking health care and benefits, but also they were working at really intense, high political levels, fighting, for example, for the broader coverage of Puerto Rico and Puerto Ricans under social policy. So the book traces the fight of the ongoing fight, which is still happening, of Puerto Rican women to try to have more extensive coverage of Puerto Rico under the Social Security Act. And I look at the 1930s and how Puerto Rico was completely excluded under coverage from that act until there was a large amount of political mobilization to have those social policies even extended to Puerto Rico. And that Puerto Rican women, including many who became leaders in social movements, including the Puerto Rican independence movement, were leaders in the fight for extension of Social Security to Puerto Rico. And that, as for those of you who are social workers and others, you know that that is still incomplete, right? That those rights are still colonial and second class for Puerto Ricans. And I look then, at how in the United States, Puerto Rican social workers and other activists ended up being migrant advocates trying to get access to those benefits for Puerto Ricans that were in the diaspora. So the story is one around political mobilization of social work. And I'd love to, talk more about kind of the contours of that with you. But the bigger story is kind of a story of writing Puerto Rican women into political history. So it's very exciting to be able to talk about that during Women's History Month with you.
Yes, thank you so much, Emma. And now I want to get more into the nitty gritty, right? And think about the title of our event, which is, thinking about the shift between the social work to social justice. And how do you see that reflected in your work? And Emma, let's start with you. Many times social workers, care workers, and caregivers are excluded from historical narratives around activism. What do we learn from looking at these histories from this perspective? And you've talked a little bit about this already in the sort of like larger overview of the book, but I'd really love to hear like some specific examples. Like you talk about these projects that these women were working on to empower their communities. Can you tell us a little bit more about like, one specific case that you think really exemplifies why this perspective is so important? Because as you mentioned, it's not, I really find really fascinating about your work, the emphasis not just on women, but on working class women, right? And the contributions of working class women to these history. So I'd love to, if you can tell us some of the stories that you're highlighting in your book, sort of in this context.
Absolutely. Thank you for that question. So, um, one of the one of the most important things that I hope the book does is to think um, in broad but also interesting ways about the political, like what is the political, and also to kind of critically engage the concept of the ways that Puerto Rican women have been political actors, because I think a lot of the literature in political history and that has focused on activism has often tended to focus on male figures, right? I mean, just in a generalization. That's not the case for everything, but a larger generalization. So, one of the things that I was interested in thinking about Puerto Rican women's political history is like, where are the spaces where women are engaging with different kinds of political mobilization and action? And so, social policy, like I said, with something like the Social Security Act, is an exciting place to just see like women petitioning, organizing groups in Puerto Rico and in the diaspora, writing legislation, right? Picketing offices that were mistreated, where workers were being mistreated. So we see all of this different kind of political mobilization that oftentimes wasn't written into the historical record. But I would say that one of the things that was interesting for me about the project was also grappling with the complexity of the stories of individuals who were social workers. And I'll say, like, as a kind of more specific example, there are two moments in the book where I really closely look at large numbers of working class women, many who were from poor backgrounds, many who are Afro-Puerto Rican women, working class women, entering into the field of social work and transforming that field through their entry into the profession. And one moment that I look at is in chapter 2, where I show how in the 1930s, with the construction of New Deal programs, tons of all these Puerto Rican women entered into the field, and they brought their political aspirations and their dreams into the field and transformed it in really remarkable ways. And I follow especially a group of independence leaders who in the late 1920s, early 1930s, became social workers first, and then articulated ideas of social work as a possibly radical profession that could transform society as they worked within the Puerto Rican independence movement. And for me, that's a very interesting story of social work, what they called social work of the people. And this was many kind of working class women entering into the field and hoping to make it a space for organizing for Puerto Rican rights and even for Puerto Rican independence. And then the second moment that I look at, which is in chapter 6, where I look at women like Pantoja and Sanchez and others who were working class women who often received funding or support from government agencies in the 50s, 60s, and 70s to become social workers. And they join the field and they kind of explode it from within and make new kinds of civil rights institutions. So I think the project shows both those kind of moments of political mobilization, but also that perhaps some of the narratives about what we have thought of as radical or reformist political mobilization have kind of erased sometimes the stories of Puerto Rican women, especially who were working in institutions that we might not necessarily have thought of as radical, but actually their work within institutions is really radical. So you could have someone like Blanca Canales, a Puerto Rican, nationalist independence leader, working in a social welfare office during the day and then advocating for, the overthrow of the U.S. government in the night. But that would be a part of, her story overall. So that complexity, I hope, is captured in the project.
Fantastic. I love learning these stories about these really incredible women. And then Vanessa, I want to ask you sort of in a similar line. So I think for a lot of people, when they think of Julia de Burgos, they think of like, I believe, at least like in my case, right? Like I had to memorize Rio Grande de Loíza as a child in school, right? And I've read and enjoyed a lot of her poetry. And then the other thing people always talk about is how she died, right? And
Mhm.
there's very little sort of space. I think among scholars and researchers, we do know a little bit more about what Julia's life was actually like. But I think for the general audience, there's some like demythification that has to happen and to really that she was an activist, she was an organizer. I think when we talked last year, one thing that really surprised me was learning that Julia at one point was a census worker, right? Which is just such a
Mhm.
fascinating um, sort of bit of history. So, can you tell us a little bit about why it's important to highlight this part of her work, and what do you think, knowing this, helps us? How does this change our understanding of her poetry?
Good question. I just have to say I also love hearing and listening to Emma talk about these social workers. I mean, as I was reading your book, I was just in awe of all of the stories of these women and how you bring women back, like how we do women's history, right? I mean, I think it's so important and such a wonderful read. So I wanted to thank you for that. Um, I I I like the question, Cristel, because I think what you're saying is true. I mean, I think in some ways, as perhaps happens with a lot of important, well-known figures, right? Like Emma is writing about a lot of really important figures who maybe we don't know as much about, but people who we know a lot about, I'm thinking like Julia de Burgos or Albizu Campos, they become these, you know, these, there are these images of them everywhere, and people know the name and maybe know one or two things about them or one poem, as you said, Rio Grande de Loíza, but perhaps don't know a lot beyond that. So I hope that this book is an invitation to learn a lot more about her, about Julia de Burgos. Um, but I also think that this event and your question led me to think more about how we think about activism and what is activism? How do we conceptualize activism? And is it just any action that is done to bring about social, political, economic changes. And so if we think about activism in that way, that activism isn't just kind of taking to the streets, right? That's one form of activism, but there are all of these other forms of activism. So it's one of the things that I like about the way that this panel has been, this conversation has been framed, and it's one of the things that really stood out to me as I was reading Emma's book. But I would say for Julia de Burgos, she participated in a range of activities that fall under this category of activism. In the book, one of the things in the collection of the section on the essays, the first essay that's published there is titled La Mujer ante el Dolor de la Patria, and it was published in 1936. And she delivered this as a speech at a political rally in Puerto Rico to celebrate the Grito de Lares. Right, so she was on the platform. She delivered this as a public event at this public event, and the speech was later published in, I have it here, so I want to make sure that I don't mess anything up, because I pulled from lots of different journals, small journals and newspapers. So I want to make sure that I get it right. This one was in La Acción. And La Acción was a newspaper, a nationalist newspaper in Puerto Rico that kind of was dubbed as, en español, El Defensor de la Independencia de Puerto Rico, or the Defender of Puerto Rican Independence. Oh, I don't have to translate because we have people doing that work. Sorry. I'm just used to going back and forth like that. But it was published there, and I mean that's gives you a sense of how involved she was in the Nationalist Party. One of the things that's not included in the book, but I do include excerpts in my first book, in Becoming Julia de Burgos, is she was the secretary for the like a women's auxiliary to the Nationalist Party. And she regularly was writing press releases for them that were published in El Mundo about political, either making demands on political figures from the US who were coming to Puerto Rico, representatives of the sugar industry that were in Puerto Rico at the time. So she really was quite involved in that form of activism. And I would also say that her art, her poetry, and her journalism are also forms of activism. They're cultural and artistic forms of activism that are used to challenge social norms and express dissent. So that's another way in which that's another place where we can see her activism, and she does it quite a bit, right? I mean, her literature, I mean, I think literature in general is a way of influencing hearts and minds. Literature is a popular medium that can be read widely, and she does that in her poetry as well. So there are plenty of poems where we see her challenging social norms. And then there are other poems that are more overtly political and are included in this book too. I mean, she has often we focus on her poems to nature. She has these beautiful poems about nature, but she also has some really political poems, like Himno de Sangre a Trujillo, for example, where she condemns the Trujillo regime, or una canción a Albizu Campos, a poem that she wrote to Albizu Campos after he was, or while he was in federal prison in Atlanta. Um, so there's a range of activities, I would say. Her literature is one, and then her journalism, I think, is also really interesting. She she wrote for Pueblos Hispanos for 2 years. It was a very political newspaper that was founded by Juan Antonio Correger, and with funding or backing from the Communist Party of America. And it had this vision of, one of the things that stood out to me, Emma, as I was reading your book, is the way that these women, these Puerto Rican women, claimed certain rights because partly because of their US citizenship, right? I mean, they were able to use that in a way to claim, to demand certain rights from the state. And you see that happening in this newspaper too. So that, I thought of that as a point of connection. The newspaper was published between um, it was published in 1943 and 1944. So they make these demands on the state, I think resting partly on this idea that they have the protection of US citizenship, even though we can understand that it's a kind of second class citizenship. But in the section of the newspaper that she edited, the arts and culture section, she wrote a lot. I think you can, read these essays and understand that she was attempting to unify a reading public, right? A Spanish language reading public. She wanted to educate them about things that were going on in the city, help to develop a sense of belonging. She also points out in those essays different social programs and social organizations that are available. And that's like another connection to the work that Emma's doing in this book. But she encourages people to look for these social organizations that are available in East Harlem if people are looking for a place to take their children, if they're looking, for social activities to get them off the street, a safe spaces for community members to come together. She lists them at different times in these essays. So those are some examples of the activism that Julia de Burgos was involved in, both in Puerto Rico and in New York.
Yeah, I love hearing all these stories. I want to remind the audience, if you have any questions for our panelists, please drop them in the Q&A box so that way they don't get lost in the chat. And then in a little bit, we'll have a chance to ask them to Vanessa and Emma. So this is a little bit of a reunion for us because both Vanessa and Emma were part of our year one Rooted and Relational cohort. Vanessa was our faculty presider. Emma was one of our research associates. And the theme last year was archives, memory, and the present past of Puerto Rico, right? So I have to ask you a little bit of a question related to that. Can you tell us about the archival research that went into the books and what surprised you the most from delving into these archival collections? And I'll let you pick who goes first.
You want to go, Emma? Go for it.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. Well, first of all, yes, I'm so glad that we're having a bit of a reunion, and I also just love the connections that Vanessa was drawing between the books and the way that kind of the political right can often, and the words both political and activism can get really flattened, and the kind of complexity around that we can get to when we look at the biographies and writings and experiences of these kind of remarkable figures, Puerto Rican women in history. So it's really exciting. Um, when it comes to archives, so I'm a historian, so the archive is the place that I love the most, right? And Central Archive might be the place that I love the most out of all places, because it has been somewhere that I have found so much of the material for my project, but also where I've been able to make sense of my own history in ways that I never would have imagined. So I just want to say, first of all, that Central Archive is an amazing place, and having the opportunity last year to think about archives and also to work in that archive again was really, really exciting. I think I first started working in Central Archives about 20 years ago when I began work on this book. And a big part of the research for this book was looking at various collections. So, kind of getting my footing in a lot of the different records of what is called the records of the Puerto Rican diaspora in Centro's archives. And one of the most transformative experience for me, like, 15 or 20 years ago when I was first doing the research for the dissertation, was working with the collections of the Migration Division of the Puerto
Hmm.
Rican Department of Labor. And you'll see if you look at my book, I have a lot of images that Central graciously let me use in the project from those archives, including the one that was on the flyer for this event. And that is an image of a social worker in the Migration Division talking to a client of the agency coming and seeking assistance. And one of the things that I did with the records of that agency, so first of all, that agency was basically a branch of the Puerto Rican Department of Labor that operated in US cities. And it operated in a variety of different US cities, but its largest branch was in New York. And I looked at the case files that were produced by a part of that organization that was called the Social Services Division. And that social service, division was staffed by social workers who were dealing with migrant cases where migration had gone awry, right? Where people were facing different kinds of personal and larger crises as they migrated, sometimes facing hostile landlords, welfare offices that were denying their applications for assistance, discrimination, trying to get
Hmm.
their students an education, all of this different discrimination. And so the Migration Division records are very, very important to the research that I did for the first book. For the project that I was working on last year, I was working a lot with the records, the personal papers of Antonia Pantoja, Dr. Antonia Pantoja, the Afro-Puerto Rican and lesbian social work activist who is just a remarkable figure in the history of social welfare and Puerto Rican civil rights. And I was working with her papers and the records of the organization she created, Aspira, which are located at Centro. And it was amazing to both be able to sit with those records, to read them carefully, and to see the way that Pantoja had chronicled her own life in her writings and all of the wonderful ways that she had contributed to the development of ideas about community organizing and what she called community restoration through a rich life of political mobilization. And her archives are just a treasure trove of information about women's political history that was really exciting. And so I'm very grateful I had that chance. But I'll turn it over to Vanessa to talk about her archives.
Yes, so I agree with Emma that it's wonderful to have this reunion. We had a really great year together last year, and for those of you who are logging on, if you don't know about the Rooted and Relational program, you should look it up and consider applying if it fits
Hmm.
your what you need or what you're looking for. It's a really amazing program. So for this particular project, I was not really working on it last. I wasn't working on was not working in archives for this project last year because for the most part the book was done. Um, I was, I think, still doing some copy editing, perhaps. Um, but it was a wonderful opportunity for me to reflect on Julia de Burgos's archive as I was working with the fellows last year. We were reading together and workshopping um, papers. Julia de Burgos's archive is mostly kept with her family. Her family mostly has the archive in their home. And so there are now two different family members, two nieces who um, pretty much are custodians of that archive. Um, but of course, I worked with other archives, Centro being a really important archive as I was developing this book and my first book on Julia de Burgos. Um, and and I think um, and then a lot of the published material. There are very, very few manuscripts, original manuscripts today of Uriel de Burgos's work. The letters, Burgos's letters to her sister are held by the family. The originals are held by the family, but they published those in an edition in 2015. So, so I did get a chance to look at some of those. And there were other materials that they have that were still wonderful um, to see. It's different when you're looking at the original and you are holding it in your hand as opposed to looking at a digitized version. I also spent a lot of time in Centro looking at the old newspapers, the Spanish language press in New York to find um, uh, Julia de Burgos's publications, and I used those as originals because we don't have any manuscripts of her prose, as far as I know. It's interesting to use those as originals because as is the case with publications, even today, there are typos that make their way into the publication. So when I was looking at these manuscripts, there was one example that I can give you. It's an essay that she wrote on Eusebia Cosme. She has a whole section um, in her in the work that she did for Pueblos Hispanos, where she does these like interview essays. They're like profiles on Latin American writers, musicians, artists who were in New York visiting. Some of them had moved to New York, but most of them were in New York visiting. And she interviews them for the paper. And in Alceria Cosme's interview essay, she writes a name, and I was like rompiéndome la cabeza trying to figure out who is she talking about. And I think it's a typo, but I couldn't figure it out. And then, of course, I called someone who wrote a book where he wrote a pretty significant chapter on Eusebia Cosme. And I said, "Could you tell me who this is or what this is?" And he knew immediately. He says, "That is a phonetic spelling of this other person's name." I would have never guessed it, but I think that to me was so revealing or so telling about the kind of work that we do in the archive and how we do get to a point where there are things that we know them so intimately because we spend so much time with these figures. So that was a wonderful moment of collaboration with another scholar and being able to call on a scholar and say, like, can you help me with this? And it was amazing how he immediately knew, um, not because he'd seen it before, but just because he knew that he was this man that Eusebia Cosme mentions is someone that she had collaborated with quite a bit. So there were really wonderful moments like that, and then there were other frustrating moments where, I was looking for a date on something, and I to the very end, was looking for the date and couldn't find it, and the book went to press without the complete date because I couldn't find it. So there are those like those frustrating moments, but also really wonderful moments in the archive, and particularly working on an archive on a figure like Julia de Burgos, who was practically homeless at the end of her life and didn't really have a way to preserve her work in the end. And this is something that I'd love to hear Emma talk about a little bit. But in the end, she was hospitalized in Welfare Island, at the hospital in Welfare Island, and was working with a social worker who was helping her try to transition back um, into society and to be able to live on her own. And I know, Emma, you mention at times in the book how these women were social workers, but also um, sometimes benefited from the system or used the system. And so I don't know. I was thinking about that connection as I was reading your book and thinking about Julia de Burgos.
That's perfect because my next invitation was actually going to be to have you ask each other a question. So, Emma, do you want to answer Vanessa's and then you can ask her something as well?
I actually have a different question for Emma, but I have a lot of
Okay,
questions for
go for it.
Emma.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But we
So
can
we
go
can
with
go
that
for
question. We can go with that question, Emma. We can start
no,
there.
we can, or you can combine them into both. Like you can also throw your other question in as well.
Yeah, combine. That sounds good.
Okay, so that was one, that was just a thought that I had, and I was, a connection that I made as I was reading your book. Um, but the question I thought that I would ask you for today is, if I'd love to hear you think a little bit or think out loud or talk to us a little bit about how you think about women's biography, think with and think through
mhm.
women's biography. You mentioned it during the seminar last year, and then as I was reading, you mentioned that in the book too, and you say I wrote it down. You say something. I'm quoting from your book. Puerto Rican were busy, Puerto Rican women were busy shaping politics and history. And I love that. And I'd love to hear you talk out loud a little bit about your approach of thinking through biography, women's biographies.
Thanks so much, Vanessa. Yeah, so I think one of the things that I wrestled with in telling this story was that oftentimes the narratives that can get told about specifically social welfare institutions or the state or government entities can kind of obscure the human experience, right? They can end up focusing on, large scale social and political programs and organizations. And a lot of the history that I was building on and kind of histories of women and gender that we're dealing with the history of the colonial state in Puerto Rico and also of social welfare agencies have very rightly pointed out kind of the dehumanizing elements that those institutions can end up enacting, right? And how people kind of fall through the cracks or get lost in those systems, or how those systems target certain individuals for regulation and reform. And my work very much like builds on that scholarship and thinks about it, but also sought to, in the project, to think through what are the experiences of people trying to make a life within those structures, even facing those forms of oppression. And so the biographies, for example, or the kind of smaller, little mini kind of biographies and stories of individual women, especially working class women and clients that I use. So, for example, in chapter 3, I really focus on reconstructing the lives of working class women who applied for social welfare benefits. A lot of that work was kind of inserting a different narrative about how women had fought for rights against and within the welfare state that was emerging in Puerto Rico. And I can do that through examples, like showing a snippet of someone's life, but it becomes much more powerful if I can walk people through that time period, looking at these mini biographies and seeing how women were contesting the state. So in that instance, that kind of focus on the biographical within that structure, I think allows for a more human narrative of social welfare. When it comes to the kind of larger figures who were social workers that I have more information about, those stories I think really allow for a rewriting of the political history, right? Just because women were not only involved in all of these moments and organizing politically, but also because their papers and their writings, and just like you're saying with your example, wonderful examples of Julia de Burgos, show this like rich wealth of engagement with the state, with political actors, with figures, this range of political figures. And the social workers that I encounter, they also had these kind of fascinating and capacious lives where they were both shaping history and very deeply involved in the political project of shaping what the Puerto Rican state would look like, contesting the state, arguing that it should look differently, trying to build new forms of social organization and community. So the biographies allow me to tell a different story. One of the things, like right now, I'm writing this biography of Antonia Pantoja, and one of the reasons, first of all, that I got involved in this work was through being just captivated by how her life in the archive, that I was seeing and reading the archival documents, that there was so much about her story that I felt like still should be told, that she was involved in just so much. And there's been wonderful projects that have worked to restore her legacy already. But there's so much more, right? I hope there'll be 5, 6, 10 biographies of her life in the future, because she did so many wonderful things. But also, what drew me to the biographical was because it not only humanizes history, it makes it more engaging for a readership. So I have taught women's history for many years, and I teach a class on Latina women in biography. And my students in that class always have the best time, and they love the unit on Pantoja. And before I even decided to write about her, I was teaching her memoir,
Mhm.
teaching documents from Centro's archive. And what it taught me was that students would engage with her legacy in such a different way if it was presented in a biographical format. And so my hope is that in writing about her through this biographical mode, that it will also allow for an entryway for a new kind of generation of young people to engage Puerto Rican women as political agents and makers of history. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you.
Fantastic. Now, Emma, do you have any questions for Vanessa?
Yeah. So one of the things so first of all, this is just a beautiful volume. It encapsulates all of these remarkable different pieces of her life. This is such an ambitious project that Vanessa engaged in. And one of the things that really struck me was this wonderful cohort or community of contributors that she had brought together to translate documents and to be involved in the project. And I was struck by that, because so much of our work in academia can be like unnecessarily isolating. But also, I was wondering, what was it like for you to kind of build this archive, as you said, of this published archive, but also to do it in conversation and collaboration with all of these wonderful writers and their, poets and other individuals that and so could you tell us a little bit about what that was like, and also how that shaped how you think about both Julia de Burgos, but also, the other women that I know that you're starting to write about for your new project.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much. And I'm really glad that you brought that up, because um, I haven't yet talked about that tonight. And that is a really important part of the book. Um, there are, I want to say, 10 translators who helped with the translation or who contributed translations to the book. And I really wanted, I mostly they contribute translations to the poetry. Robin Myers, who's this wonderful, amazing, award-winning translator, and she's having quite a year because I think she's won her most recent translation has won the National Book Award in translation and has been a finalist for these other really significant translation prizes. And I'm not surprised because she's a really wonderful translator. So when she embarked on this project of translating the letters initially, when we were talking about the translation of the letters, it was really wonderful to talk about tone. We spent a lot of time talking about tone and what would be the tone of the letters. She wanted to try to capture a familial tone, which obviously Julia uses in these letters because she's writing to her sister, um, but also capture a 1940s
Hmm.
tone. And those were wonderful conversations for the poetry because, as you know, or as many people know, Jack Agüero's published a bilingual volume of Julia de Burgos's poetry. It's quite complete. I think since that publication there may be a few additional poems that have been found, but it really includes most of her poetry. I felt that um, I thought it would be interesting to invite a range of poets and translators to translate the poetry since we already have a translation that exists. And so I wanted kind of fresh takes on it. I really did not attempt to bring the poets into or the translators into a coherent style. Let's say I wanted them to bring their own translation style to the poetry. Um, and that was I really enjoyed that too, because as I read their translations and we often did go back and forth on things. I'd ask them questions or, I had questions about maybe the way that they translated something or um, those conversations were really wonderful too. And to your question about how it shaped my understanding of Julia de Burgos. I mean, it really led, I think, to a very um, deep engagement with her work. I mean, to sit and have these conversations with these amazingly talented translators about word choice and about the grammar of a particular sentence and what was she really trying to say here. I mean, that was just really incredible. And so it gave me, I think, a different appreciation for her work and also for the task of translating, the task of the translator. It just really it was really a wonderfully collaborative project in that way. And many times these conversations were happening over the phone. So that was really great too, to have that kind of dialogue with the um, with the with the translators. And then I know we're going to open it up to the audience
Hmm.
very soon, so I will just say two sentences about um, the new project that you mentioned, Emma. So I am working on a new book project that I'm calling a biography of a generation. And so I'm looking at a generation. It's not the title of the book, but that's my description of the book for the moment. Um, I'm looking at a generation of 1980s Latina women writers, Latina feminist writers. And I think of that, I see them as a cohort. I understand them as a cohort, and that's why I'm thinking about them as a generation of writers that I'm going to write about, or that I am writing about. And yeah, it's a really exciting and fun project, and I'm enjoying it. And I want to think about specifically think about intellectual friendships between women. So in my first book and all of the work that I've done on Julia de Burgos, um, in many ways, there people have written about her as kind of a lone wolf. And in a lot of the work that I've done on her, you can see that in some ways, um, she didn't have a large community of, it was a different time. Central didn't exist, for example. So she was in New York without a kind of support network, right? She didn't have family, she didn't have institutions necessarily that were supporting her. Although she does write about the support networks that she had with on Welfare Island with the hospital and the social worker, etc. Um, so it has just made me think a lot about the importance of intellectual friendships for the kind of work for between women, for the kind of work that we do, and how important those are to sustaining women's creativity. And I think, throughout the literature, philosophical literature on amity, on friendship, there's very little about women's friendships. So, so that's the through line for the new book, but it does grow out of thinking about, it does grow out in part thinking um, about that kind of isolation that Julia experienced here in New York.
Wonderful. So I am going to pull three questions from the audience, one for each of you, and then one for both of you. So, and let's start with Vanessa. If you have any commentary on the poetry that Julia Burgos wrote in English. And then for Emma, somebody says in 1971, we hired Yolanda Sanchez to direct the CCNY Puerto Rican Development Program. I wonder if she spoke or wrote about her years at CCNY while collaborating with the students of PRSU. And then the question for both of you, which I think is a really great one to close out this conversation, is I'd love to hear the speakers talk more on the social justice, activism, and everyday life, specifically in relation to feminist movements that they identify, disidentify. What does a feminism emerging from these women encompass? Emma, why don't you get started? Oh, you muted.
That sounds great. Yeah, so the question I love hearing, I was trying to hear it. I don't see it in the chat, but the question about the hiring of Yolanda Sanchez in 1971 and her her broader organizing. I think that's what I heard. So one of the things that I did in the project was I talk about Yolanda Sanchez's work as kind of a hook in the biography and the way that, or sorry, in the beginning of the project, the book, and her biography as a way of linking together and thinking about the connection between kind of an earlier moment of political mobilization, so in the 60s and the 70s, and how different individuals became a part of social movements, and then the emergence of community organizing. So I look at the kind of trajectory of her life and experience, but it's not that extensive. So if you see the book, it's not the majority of the book. So I think there's a lot more biographical detail about her life that I probably don't have here. So I'll admit a little bit of ignorance about all the particularities of her experience. But one of the things that I was really drawn to is how she worked collaboratively with Antonia Pantoja, the way that she was the first social worker that was hired by Aspira, and developed those organizations, and her commitment to linking the organizations that were in New York to Puerto Rico, and her traveling to Puerto Rico for the first time herself, bringing students. And that goes through the 70s and the 80s, this kind of linking together of these two projects, and her commitment also to the kind of political freedom and independence of Puerto Rico, even as a diaspora Puerto Rican. And I think that story is one that I really wanted to capture, both how social work provided her a platform for professionalization and to become a part of social movements, but also how she challenged the constraints around the field of social work itself. And so she worked in so many institutions, and highlighting the CCNY and other organizations. One of the things that has really struck me, both in the archive and also in my now work on Pantoja, is how Puerto Rican women were some of the founders of what we now know as Puerto Rican studies, right? That so many Puerto Rican intellectuals who were social workers and then community organizers also are the pioneers of the field of Puerto Rican studies itself. And I hint at that in my final chapter, but that's something that I deeply want to explore in my next project on Pantoja and my other work. And so if those of you are hearing this, I can't see you, all of you in the chat, but please email me if you're interested or you have more questions or you want to talk to me. I'm, again, a professor at the University of Connecticut. You can find me online, and I would love to hear more stories about Sanchez and others. So I'll say that I have found a certain amount, but I'm also just really eager to engage more. When it comes to feminism, this is something I'm also thinking a lot about, and I have a couple new articles that are coming out that are more specifically about feminism and Puerto Rican women who were feminists, and one of them is about Puerto Rican women who were a part of the welfare rights movement in the U.S. and founded a variety of different welfare related projects, and another is about sorry. So I'm looking at a couple different moments in kind of the history of Puerto Rican women's engagement with feminist politics. Another is about a Puerto Rican feminist named Carmen Delgado Vota, who wrote a series of kind of biographical books, but also helped found and participated in a number of feminist organizations. So what I would say is that from 1917 in my book with Beatriz Lasaya, she identified as a feminist and was involved in many different Puerto Rican feminist organizations on the island. Through the 1930s, all the women that I look at were involved in various different feminist groups that self-identified as feminist. Not every single person, but the majority were. Others were agitating within social movements to lead them in feminist directions through the 1960s and 70s, where Puerto Rican women, challenged organizations to deal with feminist issues and built feminist organizations. That the book is a history of social workers, but the majority of them were very, very much deeply involved in feminist activism, and many of them use that term. Some of them were also critical of that term and how it could elide or, obscure the complexity of women within that movement, and that feminism could be something that was, white feminism or was not reflecting their needs or desires, and sometimes rejected that label. But there were also many that took on that label or that fought to make feminism something that reflected a Puerto Rican experience. And that complexity, I think, is in the book, but also is something that Puerto Rican scholars and feminist scholars right now are very much trying to write into the historical record, the kind of complex, tangled relationship between Puerto Rican women and feminism, but also the centrality of Puerto Rican feminists to the whole history of feminism, both in Puerto Rico, Latin America, and the US. So that's too long of an answer. Sorry. Vanessa.
No, that's a great answer. So I think it was a question about the two poems that Julia de Burgos wrote in English, or the two poems that we have anyway. There may be more, but these are the two that we have, and those are included in this new book, and they're translated into Spanish by Mayra Santos Febres, actually. So they're wonderful translations, and what can I say about those poems? I think that there's some writing about them in the book. and in the notes in the book. I will just very quickly say that the note that I left off, where I left off, about thinking about um, intellectual friendships between women. I mean, I think those two poems in particular are, as far as we know, the last two poems that Julia de Burgos wrote. They're the last ones that we have. Um, and and she was extremely isolated. She writes about that kind of isolation, about this experience of solitude. Um, she says repeats the word solitude over and over again in that final poem, The Sun in Welfare Island, and writes about, you know, being forgotten but unshaken, or living among her comrades of silence. So these are really powerful images, I think, of isolation. Um, and yeah, I mean, they're wonderful, complex poems that should be read, and those are just a few lines of my reading of them. Um, so she was she was sort of um, isolated in this hospital. She's hospitalized for several months at the end of her life, and wrote those poems while she was in the hospital, and um, mailed them to her sister. Um, and there's several. That's one of the poem. That poem, Farewell in Welfare Island, is one of the poems that we have several manuscript drafts, and they're very different. Actually, there are like several lines that are completely different. So it's really hard to know. They're not all dated, or so it's hard to know which is the definitive version. And I explain that in my book, that in the end I picked a version, and I explained why I use that as the final version. Um, so you can read a little bit more about that in both in my introduction and in the notes in the book. But um, yeah, I mean, I think I'm not sure I can say too much more right now, but they're beautiful. They're beautiful, kind of haunting images from. And when we think about the fact that these poems were written while she was hospitalized in Welfare Island. I mean, now, Welfare Island, if you go to, well, it's no longer called Welfare Island, it's called Roosevelt Island, and it has these beautiful luxury condos. But at the time, it was very isolated from New York City, and she would write about how the nurses and the social workers would organize day trips into Manhattan, and they would go to a play or go to a movie theater, and the patients would. So that's the context. When she's writing these poems, she's writing to family members, asking them to come visit her because she's in the hospital. She says the social worker brings her clothes so that she can have something to wear when she leaves the hospital, but the social worker has told her that they cannot discharge her because she doesn't have a place to go, and she doesn't have a job, so she can't sustain herself financially. So they're very sad poems, I think, too, in that regard. Um, in terms of Julia de Burgos's connection to feminism, um, I cannot think of a of a moment when she uses that term or identifies with that term. Um, or with a particular feminist movement, I would say. In some sense, she's writing largely or writing in between the two larger feminist movements of the 1930s and the 1960s, right? She was born in 1914, and really the the movement that she writes about the most is the nationalist movement and the movement for independence. I think her concern or preoccupation, I don't know if I want to call it feminism. It's not the term that she used, but her concern or her preoccupation for women's roles in society, women's position in society, women's rights, women's living conditions, all of that is in her work. And it's in her poetry, it's in her essays, it's in her letters. So in that sense, I think it's clear that she had a commitment to what to those preoccupations that align with a feminist movement. But it's not a term that that I can recall her using. But many of her poems, especially her from her first collection, she did align herself with the groups of women who were also struggling for independence, right? For the independence of Puerto Rico. So in that sense, she was certainly aligned to those women's groups, women's organizations that were women's auxiliaries that were fighting for independence. But that was her avenue for that kind of activism and the preoccupations around women, I would say.
All right. Well, we're out of time, but I want to just give a deep thanks to both Vanessa and Emma for this wonderful conversation and for sharing with us about their amazing work. I am so looking forward to your biography of Antonia Pantoja and this cohort biography and thinking through intellectual friendships and women. And once those are out, I'm sure we'll be talking about them here at Centro as well. Thanks again. Thanks everybody for joining us this evening. Please keep a lookout on social media for more great events coming up, and we will see you all soon. Thank you again. Gracias. Buenas noches.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you
you,
so much,
Cristel.
everyone. Thank
And
you.
thank you, Emma. And thanks to
Thanks.
the audience of the questions. Thanks, everyone.